All right, the time has come for us to discuss the end of Reconstruction and to do a final analysis, to do the review on, was it successful? Did it accomplish the goals? Did we win the peace? Remember, we're fighting the Civil War to accomplish three goals as outlined by Abraham Lincoln. Not everybody's on board with all three of those goals. Let's look at what Lincoln said we were fighting for versus what actually happened. Let's do the final analysis here. Um, as we start talking about this, we'll look at the reasons why Reconstruction came to an end, and we'll look at the successes and a lot of failures. And that's one of the big things that we're going to cover today. So if you look at that graphic organizer, there are the reasons. Right now, I want to focus on the successes. Um, Basically, Lincoln's first two goals are achieved. Definitely the first one, the reunion of the country. All 11 states that form the Confederacy are then and still now are part of the United States of America. So, goal number one, mission accomplished. Goal number two, getting rid of slavery. The 13th Amendment does outlaw slavery. Although we might look at what the economic situation was for the newly freed slaves for decades, um, where there's a lot of former slaves that are then trapped in that cycle of poverty with sharecropping, but that's clearly superior to being a slave. It might not be quite the economic freedom that they were hoping for or we would define today, but goal number two, mission accomplished. Goal number three, creating equality, that is not going to work at all. Okay. So a couple more things about the successes before I move on from that. Again, I've talked about this one, that the Southern educational system is really one of the beneficiaries of Reconstruction, the creation of a public school system, which prior to the Civil War was the domain of primarily the planter class. They could send their kids to colleges and schools, but few other people in the South were educated. The other big success in the South is that Southern infrastructure is rebuilt, and not just rebuilt, but actually built up to standards with the North and increasingly with the West. For instance, the railroad system prior to the Civil War in the South was this hodgepodge of different types of railroads where, if the wheels of the track on a railroad is of different, what's called gauge, different distances, it's obviously problematic. You can't run a railroad car on gauge that is incorrect. So that standardized Southern infrastructure is updated and rebuilt. And again, some of the Southern cities that are destroyed as a result of the war actually are going to take advantage of that and come out of it stronger than what they were going into the war. Okay. Now the failures, I'll come back to those quite a bit, but you can look at them there that it's not something where the country just immediately forgives and forgets, and we all move on, and then there is a full embrace of racial equality. That's not going to happen. Okay. So as far as that goal of Reconstruction, that is a failure. All right, a couple of things here. One, I'm telling you now, just to give you a heads up, there's going to be a password at the end of this that you need to use to log into the question. So make sure you stick around to get the password to be able to answer the questions. And for those of you who are doing the right thing and taking notes right now, you see this slide. I need you to add a word to this, a fifth bullet point. And the fifth bullet point you need to add is the word fatigue. Fatigue looks like it's spelled fatigue, A-F-A-T-I-G-U-E. Fatigue, just being tired of it. The analogy that I usually use for that one, because it's one that I'm familiar with, one that I lived through, and that is where the United States was and where the American mind was on September 12th, 2001. The day after the two towers fell, the country was laser focused on helping those people and getting even, stopping future attacks. Let's go after the people that did this and make sure that they can't do this again. And as days and weeks wore on, as the war on terror began, and then as years wore on, it becomes less and less of a focus. Now, theoretically, that war on terror is still going. But whereas it was of primary importance and at the front of everybody's mind, and 100% this is what we're doing as a country in those days right after September 11th, today, as we sit here 19 years removed, it is barely a footnote in our national conversation. What are we going to be focusing on? Well, for this year, COVID has been obviously the thing that we're laser focused on. So that war on terror, we've moved on to the next issue. And it's similar from everything you read about the Civil War. In those days and weeks, and even the first couple of years after the war, as the country has bled and fought and struggled over this issue of secession and putting the country back together and let's get rid of slavery. At first, there was quite a bit of support for a continued effort and focus on that in the North. There had to be some sort of reckoning for all of the blood and punishment that had gone into the Civil War. But as the years and then a decade wears on, even people that lost close loved ones in the war, where you might have woken up every morning crying right after you found out the news, years down the line, life moves on. You're on to the next problem that pops up. And as we're going to see here, there are other problems that pop up. And so one of the reasons why Reconstruction comes to an end is fatigue as a country, particularly those people in the North, the white Northerners that are the kind of great deciding factor here in how interested in this are they. They're just starting to be ready to move on. And let's run this down, why they're ready to move on. First and foremost, they have come to associate the word Reconstruction with the word theft. With the amount of money that is flowing into the South for Reconstruction, with the number of government contracts and the amount of money that is being poured into rebuilding cities and infrastructures and everything that goes into trying to undo the damage of 4 years of Civil War, there's obviously many, many opportunities for those people that are engaged in that to steal from the government. And so, like anytime there's large government spending, there's going to be some money that gets lost in the shuffle. There's going to be people that are going to take advantage of that. It's the kind of thing where some people would get a reconstruction contract to build or rebuild a bridge or a building or something like that. And either they would do just a terrible job, or in some cases they would get the money and just take off and never be seen again. And so one of the things that happens with this, Ulysses S. Grant, who became president in 1869, who's going to see the country through most of Reconstruction, he's never personally accused of doing anything wrong, but one of the things that Grant is accused of doing is putting too much trust in friends that he shouldn't have put trust in, that took advantage of that. And his lack of oversight over those people leads to the loss of many, many dollars. And people are going to be tired of paying for it. Okay. And let's tie that together with our next bullet point there, which is the economy. In 1873, the economy enters into what today we would probably call a depression, a real economic downturn that happens as a result of the collapse of some railroad companies and some of the monetary decisions that had been made during the Civil War and the years after. And the economy of the United States goes in a real funk. And people primarily vote their wallet. There are a lot of issues that people vote on, but what is happening economically is usually the number one driver of what people and how people are going to vote. And there's some truth to, things that you can point to as evidence of that. And there's a little bit of an editorial comment on my part, but generally people vote how the economy is going. And in 1873, with this downturn, people are going to move on and say, I have a more important need for my dollars than pouring them into a Reconstruction program that I might only kind of be interested in to begin with. And now that it's come to be associated with theft and corruption, I don't want any more of my tax dollars to go towards Reconstruction, because those dollars that are going into Reconstruction are not magic dollars that are pulled out of nowhere. Those are tax dollars that people are paying to the United States government that are then put towards this Reconstruction effort. And with an economic downturn, with money increasingly scarce, people are going to say, you know what, something's got to go, and Reconstruction is what I want to give up. One of the things that brings Reconstruction to an end, or brings about the advances that had happened during Reconstruction, was the use of violence. And so when it says why Reconstruction ends, one of the things that we're looking at here is, why do those positive gains that come out of Reconstruction come to an end? And primarily what is happening here is Southern whites, as Reconstruction comes to an end and as the Army is withdrawn from the South, as martial law in any way, shape, or form comes to an end, Southern whites are going to reassert their authority over Southern governments. They were not interested and did not approve of the Reconstruction advances that were being wrought by the Republicans, where they were trying to work towards racial equality and increasing African American access to the vote. The Democrats are opposed to that. And many Southern whites are not opposed to the use of violence to scare and prevent African Americans from using any of their political rights, like voting. And that's going to allow Southern whites to regain control of those state governments. And one of the things that's increasing that is that as the years wear on, where at first there was a general attitude by many in the North that people that had been Confederates should be barred from participating in politics, some of that is starting to wear off as an increasing number of ex-Confederates are pardoned and allowed to return to political life in the South. The sum total of that, when you put that all together, is that white Southerners realized that if they kept their votes together as a block, and so if they all voted for the Democratic Party and didn't split their vote between the Democrats and the Republicans, if Southern whites voted for the Democratic Party as a group, then the Republicans and the advances that they have brought to Reconstruction are going to cease to exist. That comes to be known as the Solid South. For 100 years, anytime there was a presidential election, or if you wanted to be a politician in the South, if you weren't a Democrat, you didn't stand a chance. So for 100 years, it was known as the Solid South. You could just pencil in the Democrat they were going to win the elections in the South. And it was that unity that is able to bring about an end to Republican Reconstruction efforts. And that is going to allow Southern whites to reassert their control over Southern state governments and eliminate African Americans from any role in the political process, because they're outnumbered. There are more whites than there are blacks. And if the whites are keeping their votes together, then African Americans have no chance of winning elections. So the event that ends Reconstruction is the election of 1876, which leads to the Compromise of 1877. It's one of those quirks of American politics. Um, just as a word of explanation, how does the election of 1876 lead to the Compromise of 1877? Think about when presidential elections occur. Presidential elections happen in November. And so by the time the popular vote is counted up and by the time the Electoral College actually meets and tallies their vote, the year is over. So the new president is not sworn in until, at that time, March. Now it's January. They have changed and shortened that time period. We'll study why that occurs when we get to the Great Depression. But the thought process was that they gave them until March for the new president to be ready. And so by the time the election is made official and the new person's ready to take office, the calendar has turned, which makes it confusing a lot of times when you're studying history, because you'll see the election of so and so year, but then you just see that the person doesn't become president until the next year. And that all makes sense when you think about the election happening in November. All right, so here's the deal. The election of 1876 is very, very close. You've got on one hand the Democrat, Samuel Tilden, running against the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. And this is really the first chance that the Democrats have had to win since the Civil War. For the first several elections after the Civil War, the Republicans, all they had to do was, the phrase that they used at that time was wave the bloody shirt. They just had to remind people, hey, we're the party that stayed with all the good guys. There weren't any Republicans that joined the Confederacy. You know, we're the ones that were on the right side of history. And that guaranteed Republican victory for the first several presidential elections. But by 1876, as we have talked about on the previous slide, the Reconstruction is getting old and the Civil War is getting a little bit more distant in the memory. So that Republican death grip that they had on the White House is starting to loosen up a little bit. Plus, as we will see, especially after this election, the Democrats, are starting to come back into power a little bit in the South. They're starting to gain some of their voter base back. So the election of 1876 is very, very close. And actually, when you add up the popular vote, the vote that is cast by the citizens of the United States, Samuel Tilden gets more popular votes than Rutherford B. Hayes. But as we know, because we have covered, that does not make you president of the United States. You have to win the Electoral College. And the question there was that in some of the southern state governments in particular, but also Oregon, they had their Electoral College vote, and the state election results were so disputed that it wasn't clear who was going to win in the Electoral College. And so it looked for a time like there was going to have to be a court case to settle this all out and, figure out who actually has the votes and who has the Electoral College votes to win the presidency. They put together a commission to study this, to try and keep it out of the courts as well. But the decision is made that they didn't need to throw this into the courts. This didn't need to work all the way through the Supreme Court. The Democrats decide that they will essentially let the Republicans win, that Tilden, all he needed was one of these contested states to go his way, and he's going to become president. Rutherford B. Hayes needs every one of the contested elections to go his way in order for him to become president of the United States. So the Democrats have a stronger claim to the White House, but they decide, here's the deal. They'll trade the White House for 4 years. They will let the Republicans win the election of 1876. In exchange for that, Rutherford B. Hayes has to promise to shut down Reconstruction. He has to promise that if he gets the White House, he will pull the troops out of the South. Now, we know from what we've looked at in earlier slides that once the troops are pulled out of the South, once the military threat isn't there to keep a lid on Southern whites returning to power and taking black votes away, then the Democratic Party will be much better off. I mentioned that idea of the solid South. So essentially, the Democrats are trading 4 years of control of the White House in exchange for their taking back over of the South, basically ruining the power of the Republican Party in the southern states. And who the Democrats, northern Democrats are selling out here are black Republicans, the ones that, theoretically the war was fought to help free. They're getting sold down the river by this decision. And so that's the deal that's struck. Rutherford B. Hayes gets the White House, and the Democrats are going to be allowed to return to power in the South as a result of that deal. And the reason that the Republicans are willing to accept that deal is if push comes to shove and this actually goes to court, they probably don't get the White House, and all of this stuff is going to happen anyway. So their position is we might as well get the White House for another 4 years in exchange for this. And so it stays out of the courts, and that brings Reconstruction to an end.
Boy, the wagon's coming down the hall, cotton on, cotton on.
So let's talk a little bit more about the return of white home rule, what Southern whites called redemption. Nobody else would call it redemption, but that's what they called it. Redemption meaning salvation from error or sin. That's the way Southern whites viewed it, the sin of Reconstruction. Like I said, nobody else on the planet would call it redemption, but that's what Southern whites called it. The idea here is that they know that if they keep their votes in a block, that they outnumber African Americans, so whites will be able to maintain a position of political power and keep African Americans in a position of political subservience. And the next step that they take, once Reconstruction's over, and once the Union Army no longer has a presence in the South, martial law is completely over. No way the Army can enforce things like the Enforcement Acts that kept the Klan underground. Once all of that is over, they then begin the process of segregation. Now, later on, we'll learn about the term Jim Crow. You probably remember that from last year when you guys were looking at To Kill a Mockingbird in your English class. I'm sure you guys talked a little bit about the concept of Jim Crow segregation. That's where this begins, is the end of Reconstruction, and with the return of white home rule, that period of redemption. So that means that the carpetbaggers, the scalawags, blacks that voted for the Republicans, they're all in a minority. The Southern whites are going to reassert their control over the entire area. How do they do that? Well, one of the ways that they do that is by reasserting their control over the vote. Now, here's the deal. Remember, the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment were added at the beginning of Reconstruction as a way to ensure that African American political rights are guaranteed. That's the way we would look at it. But actually, the 15th Amendment doesn't guarantee anybody the right to vote. What the 15th Amendment says is that you cannot be barred from voting because of your race. Now, that may sound like it's the same thing, but it isn't. And here's the deal. Although those words seem pretty cut and dried, they're not. And it is the Supreme Court that has to make meaning out of those vague terms that are in the Constitution. What does that actually mean, that you cannot be barred from voting because of your race? The Supreme Court basically pulls the teeth out of the 15th Amendment. One of the reasons is because a lot of Supreme Court justices are white supremacists and are okay with taking the right to vote away from African Americans. So what do the southern states do to take advantage of this fact that the 15th Amendment does not guarantee your right to vote? It does not say you're going to have the right to vote. It says it cannot be denied because of race. Can it be denied for other things? And the short answer is yes. You guys know that. You are barred from voting because you're not old enough. Now, that's a good example. The 26th Amendment says that you cannot be barred from voting if you're over the age of 18. You can be barred from voting for other things if you're over the age of 18, but if you're 18, you get to vote. Could a state allow a 16-year-old to vote? Yeah, they could. There's been talk of that. But the Constitution says you can't set an age higher than 18. But if you wanted to, you could set an age lower. So states still have a tremendous amount of control over who they get to say can vote, because each state runs their own elections. It's not a national election. The federal government can tell the states, here's some of the rules that you have to follow, but other than that, you guys set this all up. So what southern state governments do, once the whites have returned to power, just to grab this and put a stranglehold on white power in the southern states to make sure that African Americans don't and can't vote, is they rig the system. So they can't pass a law that says blacks can't vote, but could they pass other laws that make it really, really difficult for African Americans to vote? They can, and they do. On your list there, you've got a couple of examples of things that they did. One thing that was done was passage of a poll tax. It is exactly what it sounds like. You had to pay to vote. Now, one of the things that we have looked at in the last couple of days is the fact that former slaves were given their freedom and nothing else, so they didn't have a tremendous amount of disposable income. And we looked at the cycle of poverty that many of them fell into with the sharecropping system, where you're barely keeping your head above water, if at all. And so when push comes to shove and you don't have a whole lot of money, are you going to use that money to vote, or are you going to use it to eat? And even if you are committed to the idea of using that money to vote, because it's my right as an American to vote, here's something else to think about. Because of the white voting bloc that was the Solid South, where they're committing their votes together to the Democratic Party, if you're African American, your guy's going to lose. There's no point in voting for a Republican. He's going to lose. She's going to lose. But I'm saying he because it's still the 1800s, but he's going to lose. So why waste your money? Now, does anything about a poll tax say that you can't vote because you're black? No. Technically does not violate the 15th Amendment. Does it have all the effect of making it almost impossible for African Americans to vote? Yes. Something else that some southern states instituted was something called a literacy test. Now, most of those were subjective, meaning a subjective test is the kind of test where there's no cut and dried answer. It's not multiple choice. It's, tell me why the Civil War happened. And then if I ask you that question and you just have to kind of give me an answer, I'm going to give you a score, and I can pretty much make my score whatever I want it to be. If I want to be a jerk and twist it into a 12% just because I want to nitpick it to death, if it's subjective, I could probably do that. So if you're African American and you go to take a literacy test, you're not going to stand a chance. Even if you could read, which many of them could not, because again, it was against the law to teach a slave how to read. So especially in those years right after the Civil War, that wasn't going to be something that many former slaves were going to be capable of doing. But even if you could, the person giving the test is going to be a white person, and they're going to be able to give you a score, whatever you want on it. And then you're usually given something that's tricky to read, like something from the Declaration of Independence or something from the Constitution to begin with. You're not trying to decipher something like a second grade textbook. You're trying to state what it means. Certain passages in the Constitution mean. That's not necessarily easy for anybody. Does the literacy test say blacks can't vote? Nope. Is it designed to keep blacks from voting? Yep. Now, the last thing you have on the list, and people miss this question, so make sure you make note of this. because I have it on the test a lot. List ways that Southern states use to keep blacks from voting. Poll taxes and literacy test. Grandfather clause is not on that list. It's a little different. Some Southern states were concerned that poll taxes and literacy tests might prevent poor whites from being able to vote, because some of them are going to be illiterate and some of them are going to be incapable of paying a poll tax. So some Southern states decided, let's make sure that our poorer white brethren can still vote. And so what they did is they created a grandfather clause. And a grandfather clause said that literally, if your grandfather was a voter, then you could vote, regardless of any other requirements. If grandpa could vote, you could vote. Well, guess whose grandfathers couldn't vote? The freed slaves, because their grandfathers were slaves. And so it has all the effect of keeping blacks from voting or keeping whites from voting, and it's targeted against African Americans, but it says nothing about race. So technically, if you want to look at this and say it doesn't violate the 15th Amendment, it doesn't. It violates the spirit of the 15th Amendment, but it doesn't violate the words of the 15th Amendment. Now, some Southern states, I also should throw this at you, some Southern states were okay with their poor whites not voting because many of them had become scalawags that had worked with Republicans during Reconstruction. So in many cases in Southern states, they were fine with poor whites losing votes and not participating in the system because they were afraid that they might move into a voting bloc with Republicans or African Americans and actually give the Republicans a legitimate chance to actually win elections. Now, what does this mean? The end result, the last thing to look at here under this heading, is look at the African American participation in Congress. What happens to it? When Reconstruction ends, you go from having 16 members of Congress that are African Americans down to, by 1900, it's 0. And then it's going to stay 1 and 2 all the way through the 1960s when the Civil Rights Movement and further constitutional amendments are ratified that outlaw things like literacy tests and poll taxes. And then you're going to see the number of African Americans go back up to where it's something commiserate with African American population in the United States today. But for the better part of a century, there was 0 African American participation in Congress.
Come, cotton, come, I'm picking it by the pound. Boys, the wagon's coming down to haul the cotton home. Come, cotton, come, I'm picking it by the pound. Boys, the wagon's coming down to haul the cotton home. Come, cotton, come, I'm picking it by the pound. Boys, the wagon's coming down to haul the cotton home. Come, cotton, come, I'm picking it by the pound. Led old Billy up to the rack, beat him across the head till the captain got back. I'm picking it by the pound. Boys, the wagon's coming down, haul the cotton home. Come, cotton, come, I'm picking it by the pound. Led old Billy to the wall of trough. He wouldn't drink water and he wouldn't walk off. I'm picking it by the pound. Boys, the wagon's coming down to haul the cotton home. Come, cotton, come, I'm picking it by the pound.